I went into The Last of Us Part 2 expecting it to be a technical masterpiece with excellent gameplay and a terrible story in terms of both the way it treats the main characters and the not-so-subtle overtones regarding revenge and social issues. It's interesting because I think the leaked spoilers that hit the internet back in April were fatal to the game's public opinion among players and fans, especially those from the first game, and since I was one of the many players who had the game's main plot spoiled for me, my expectations were based entirely on this leaked information. When I actually played the game though from start to finish, twice, I had to admit that I actually really liked it. However, the 93 it got on Metacritic reflecting the universal praise and admiration it received by critics and game press doesn't seem warranted at all, and I think a lot of critics overlooked the lack of innovation in the gameplay and the major flaw in the story in favor of the brilliant acting, amazing atmosphere, groundbreaking graphics and animations, visuals, and rock-solid technical performance. The too long, didn't watch summary of this analysis is that The Last of Us Part 2 is an amazing game that I can confidently recommend as an 8 out of 10, but it's nowhere near as good as its predecessor, and it's not quite deserving of all this praise calling it the greatest game ever and a masterpiece of all time. Here's why. Also, it goes without saying, but major spoilers ahead from this point on.
Okay, we're good. Come on.
For a game that purports to take risks and do bold things, the core gameplay of Part 2 feels like Naughty Dog played it safe. Don't get me wrong, it's really fun. But for a sequel to a groundbreaking game 7 years in the making, there isn't a ton of innovation here. Going prone is a cool addition. It gives a more tactical element to navigating the levels and taking out enemies. The addition of silencers to your pistol is cool too, adding another layer to the stealth combat which was already amazing from the first game. The fact that you have to craft the silencer creates a choice to use your resources in another way other than making molotovs or bombs or medkits. You can now dodge, making melee combat much more engaging and strategic. They added new generator and rope mechanics too, but other than these additions, the core game is pretty much the same. And this is not an indictment on the quality of the gameplay because it's still really fun to play around with. But 7 years and an entire console generation later, I expected some groundbreaking features similar to the leap we saw from Uncharted 3 to 4. I mean, the latter got a grappling hook, something that we see emulated in games like Doom Eternal and Ghost of Tsushima. I have to say though, it is so much fun just blasting enemies away with explosive arrows or shooting them with incendiary rounds. Stealth gameplay feels even better than the first because of the addition of the prone mechanic and design of the levels that allow for hiding in tall grass and under objects. A really good example is at the elementary school, where the levels are built in such a way that you can exploit the terrain to make for some incredible stealth gameplay. This combination allows you to basically hide in plain sight as you go prone in the grass, silent and still, then stealth kill your enemy without him ever being the wiser. Going off this, the entire level design is outstanding. The environments are crafted in such a way that you are allowed to use your creativity and ingenuity to solve problems and work your way past enemies. You can use the gamut of weapons and tactics to your preference, and devise different ways of getting through the levels based on your style of play. If you're more of a guns a-blazing type, then you can engage in these incredibly unique firefights. If you are more of a shadowy stealth type, then you can silently take out enemies without even alerting anyone to your presence. And because the AI is so good, with enemies flanking your position or having one charge you head on while one or two back them up from cover, you get to enjoy the levels almost like a luxurious playground. The way the enemies look under things like cars and trains to check for people hiding, the way they check around corners, it all feels so realistic. The addition of dogs gives more reason to pay attention to the layout of the maps and the movements of your enemies whether engaging in stealth or not. Levels are also really easy to get around and navigate. With just a few exceptions, you can tell where to go by paying attention to the contextual clues Naughty Dog is known for providing the player with. Exploration is really good because of the new breaking windows mechanic. You see a locked door or an inaccessible area, and by just using your brain, you can forge a path in and are often rewarded with good loot. The new safe and combinations mechanic makes exploration even more fun than it was in the previous game. I talked about how this made for an immersive game in my Designer 2 video. Deducing safe combinations with critical thinking skills makes you feel smart when you figure out the code from the clues hidden around the environment. The contrast between Ellie's more surgical and sneaky style and Abby's more vicious and brutal style make for a good change in pace. You take out enemies with Ellie all stealthily, or even if you're blasting them away, it plays more like Ellie is a professional, calculated scavenger. Whereas with Abby, It seems more raw and chaotic. She's so strong she could just beat the living shit out of enemies with her bare hands, something that Ellie probably could not. Part 2 also includes something not present in the first game aside from the Left Behind DLC, human and clicker enemies together. You can use this to your advantage by luring the two factions against each other while you sit back and watch them take each other out. I played the game after the Grounded update and did my first playthrough on chapter Permadeath. As frustrating as it was to lose 30 minutes to an hour over a cheap death, I have to say it actually made for a tense experience and gives that extra rush knowing that every move could be your last. But I don't understand at all how anyone can play through the game on permadeath unless it's played on very light. As someone who completed Outlast 2 on Insane, I cannot imagine losing 20 hours of time after dying on permadeath. Although I'm sure you can find videos of people doing grounded permadeath runs all over YouTube by now. Overall, I like the brutality of the combat and the sheer disgusting depictions of the violence. The first game did this really well to illustrate the world these characters are in, and Part 2 takes it to another level. I also have to say that the intensity has been ramped up from the first game. There are some incredibly tense sequences like the Horde, the Rat King, the fight scenes between Ellie and Abby, and that building when you escape with Yara and Lev. The intensity of the combat and refinement of the exploration mechanics make up for a lack of game-changing new additions, and I would have to call the gameplay better in this game than in the first. As far as the overall atmosphere of the game, Naughty Dog continues to outdo itself in terms of excellent aesthetics. The cinematography and color of each scene are so stylish that you wonder why every game doesn't look like this. There are incredible color palettes and particle effects accentuating nearly every area. The overall world design and incredible detail of the environments is absurd. I cannot imagine how long it took the artist to create such vivid set pieces. The music is amazing, you've been hearing it throughout this video. Atmospheric, grandiose, haunting, comforting. It's its own character in a way, always there in the background, but it never feels forced like it's trying to evoke a particular response or coming on too strong. It's just right. The way they seamlessly blend the playable game space with the rendered cutscenes is unparalleled. They do it even better than God of War, which I thought was groundbreaking. Overall, this game is quite simply the most visually stunning that I've ever played, there's no doubt about it. And not since God of War have I thought a game was such a technical masterpiece. Alright, but let's be real. You did not click on this video to hear about the gameplay and aesthetics. You clicked on this video to hear yet another person trash a story as being awful, insulting, embarrassing, and just downright bad. Well, actually, I'm not going to do that because I don't think the story is any of those things. I don't think the story is inherently problematic. My problem with the story is the way that it's told. But it's a serious problem, one that holds the game back from being as good as its predecessor. I'm going to spend the rest of this video outlining why the presentation and substance doesn't work, at least not as well as the first game, and how it could have been better.
See, there's a sequel. Wasn't as good.
The story is so disjointed that it's presented as basically two games. The first half you play as Ellie, the second half you play as Abby. But there's no going back and forth except for very early in the game. If the two stories were told parallel to one another with the player jumping back and forth from one to the other, there would be a much greater opportunity to develop a connection with each one in the player's own way. The player would have an organic relation to Abby because they would be going through the things she went through as they happened, instead of having to essentially go back in time. I'm not saying it's impossible to get attached to Abby and feel for her as it is now because I'm sure a lot of people did. However, odds are most of, if not all the people who hated the story did so because they were forced to play as Abby only after she murdered Joel without any explanation as to why she did so. If her story was running simultaneously to Ellie's, we would have been treated to her character and seen her more noble qualities. We also would understand her motivations for killing Joel. Don't get me wrong, she's not an inherently bad character, and she's played outstandingly by Laura Bailey, but it's hard to care about her when she kills the main character of one of the best games ever made 2 hours in with no context. And then we never see or hear from her again until about 6 or 7 hours later. How are we supposed to relate to her after that? If her story was told alongside Ellie's, By the time she kills Joel, the player would have so much more detail and development to work with that they may even decide to side with her over Ellie. The reason why the unraveling of Abby's story to the player in the beginning doesn't work is because there's no development of Abby or any of her friends by the time she kills Joel. In hindsight, by giving us the premise from the beginning and letting Abby's story play out linearly in real time from her first appearance with her dad and Marlene at the hospital, the player would be given a far more interesting and compelling dilemma. By having Abby kill Joel in the middle of the game rather than in the beginning, the player would have to make up their own mind about whether it was justified, the same way the player from the first game had to make up their own mind about Joel lying to Ellie at the end. If you didn't know or care about the two characters, there probably wouldn't be a debate at all. Joel's actions would be considered morally wrong. But it's because the player knows what Joel went through with Sarah and the relationship he formed with Ellie along their journey that the player is given the choice to sympathize with Joel and understand why he lied to her and prevented her from being sacrificed to find a cure. Along those same lines, if we had half of the game to get to know Abby, even the most die-hard of fans from the first game might understand why she killed Joel. It's because you would know what she went through. You might even agree with it if you've come to terms with the fact that it was Joel's time to go. He's done some despicable things, and maybe it was only fair for him to meet the end that he did. But here, since Abby killing Joel happened so early in the game and her motivations for doing so are only revealed after the fact through flashback, it doesn't have nearly the same amount of emotional impact. And to me, it was a real missed opportunity. I actually like the concept of Abby's story. Problem is, it was executed poorly. The other thing too about doing this non-linearly and having Joel die very early in the game is that it's so jarring an event with so much game still to play that Ellie doesn't seem to have much in the way of grief. There's just a little bit of that with her at Joel's grave and the way she talks to Tommy and Maria, but in the next chapter, her and Dina are laughing and coking and joking like nothing ever happened. Okay, maybe not that bad, but it's enough to come across as unrealistic. One explanation for this is the world in which these characters live, and I mentioned this in my Last of Us video, how Henry and Sam's death doesn't seem to linger much for Ellie and Joel. Same with Tess. I know quite a bit of time passes between them, but maybe that's just the way it is. Everyone is so numb to death that you pretty much just move on when it happens, even if it's someone you really care about. The story's presentation has too many flashbacks. Too many important plot points are only revealed through flashback. You even have flashbacks inside of flashbacks. The only scenes that I thought should have stayed flashbacks was Ellie's birthday and the final conversation between her and Joel. It makes perfect sense within the story to reminisce about that special time that she and Joel shared together. Making the stories parallel would also have shown how similar the two main characters actually are to one another. Imagine showing the scene of Ellie and Dina loading up and riding right next to the scene of Abby, Manny, and Mel doing the same. I understand that with some of this stuff it creates a problem with time as the two scenes do not happen chronologically at the same or even similar times as one another, but this can be solved by either laying out both timelines to as chronologically close as possible, which would be possible because of all the flashbacks, or you could loop Abby's timeline back around so that when Joel's death occurs in Ellie's timeline, it can be remembered by Abby as a flashback, like something could trigger her memory or something. Doing this would also accentuate the often used but true cliche that the hero is a villain in someone else's story and vice versa. Joker did a good job demonstrating that. The game itself even hints at this as the Ellie fight in the theater closely mirrors the David fight from the first game. Just as David was seen as a monster from Ellie's perspective, Ellie is seen the same way through the eyes of Abby. This is how I would have laid everything out. Start the game off as Abby with her dad. The casual player will probably say to themselves, who the hell is this? This isn't the girl from the cover. Remember, this is how the first game started too. You didn't play as Joel or Ellie, you played as Sarah. Unless someone told you, you didn't know who Sarah was. In the same way, you would be introduced to Abby and her story. We would also be introduced to Owen. Then we would get keyed in on the fact that a girl that Marlene talked about that was immune was found and that they need Jerry to look at her right away. Well, we know who Marlene is from the first game. Now it starts making sense. This guy is the doctor who is going to operate on Ellie so that a vaccine can be created. Then we would see Abby walk in on Jerry lying dead on the ground. Well, we know how that happened too. Joel. With just one scene, the entire arc of Part 2 is laid out. The doctor who Joel killed at the end of Part 1 is Abby's dad. Abby's entire world was taken from her by the beloved main character of the first game. Then I would have kept playing as Abby during the flashback to when she is with Owen at the marina. By this point, we're about an hour in, and it's all been spent developing Abby's character. Now I would switch to the first scene in the game where Joel reveals the secret to Tommy. Then the Ellie flashbacks with Tommy sniping the infected and Ellie confronting Joel about what happened in Salt Lake City. And then with Joel finally revealing to Ellie what happened. Then we would go back to Abby, this time with the scene where she tells Owen that she has a lead on Tommy's location. This would also serve to show the passage of time, reflecting that the story will focus on Ellie and Abby as adults. Then we go to Ellie and Dina at the bar, with Joel stepping in. By this point, we have been fully introduced to Abby, and the background has been set as to what happened in the time between Part 1 and Part 2. Now we would have Ellie going out on patrol with Jesse. So to recap, the only flashback scenes not already presented are Ellie's birthday and Joel and Ellie's final conversation. These scenes are best kept where they are in the actual game. Ellie goes out on patrol with Dina, Abby escapes the horde and then starts to kill Joel, and Ellie finds them just as Joel dies. At this point, we're about 4.5 to 5 hours into the actual game, depending on how much time you took. As it stands, Abby kills Joel roughly 1 hour into the game, so we're talking about roughly 4 times longer of a game. 4 times the character development, 4 times the opportunity to form an opinion about Abby compared to how it stands now. But here's the biggest change. For the rest of the game, keep switching back and forth to Ellie and Abby. After Ellie's day 1, now we play Abby's day 1. After Ellie's day 2, now we play Abby's day 2, and so on. With the stories running parallel to one another, the player has the opportunity to evaluate both characters in real time. The player can decide who to sympathize with more. The player can decide which character to root for. As it stands, you play through all of Ellie's story, then circle back to Abby's. By the time Abby tracks down Ellie in the theater, you almost forgot that you even played as Ellie at all. By interspersing the stories, the narrative is presented like Heavy Rain, where you experience all 4 characters at the same time. It also makes the revelation of events all the more impactful. When you are introduced to Bear and Alice in Abby's day 1, they seem really sweet and loyal. It makes you feel something when you kill them as Ellie, knowing what they're like. Same with someone like Nora. She helps Abby out as Abby is helping Yara with her arm. Maybe you don't feel as good torturing her as Ellie later on. By laying out the story sequentially and giving the player the chance to experience both as they're happening, the player would be given much more opportunity to feel for the characters and their motivations, which would have given the story in this story-driven game more structure and cohesion. At the very least, it would have taken the sting out of killing off Joel so early in the game, then never seeing the killer until 6 hours later, at which time you are forced to play her story out until the end. And this is important because for me personally, this is why the story fails to deliver on the magic of its predecessor. The even bigger problem is that while the despicable, heinous acts that Joel committed in the first game were bad, nothing rose to the level of killing off the main and beloved character of the franchise. So the player is being asked to do something extremely difficult. Forgive Abby for killing off Joel. But notice I said difficult, not impossible. This is why I feel that by presenting Abby's story simultaneously with Ellie's, the player would have been given a much more compelling arsenal of development by which they could use to relate to Abby despite killing off the main character of the first game. But as it stands now, you have to play half the game knowing what Abby did and seeking revenge, then playing the other half as her trying not to let it get in the way of her story. This is why The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't measure up to its predecessor. The first several chapters, aside from the prologue, don't feel as if they add anything of substance to the story. The beginning mostly serves as exposition into what's been going on between Joel and Ellie and the residents of Jackson in the time since the first game. It feels incredibly forced though. What made the first game so good is that you went on this journey between the two characters and got to experience their relationship develop in real time. You felt connected to them, almost as if you were right there with them traveling through the apocalyptic ruins of Pittsburgh and such. Here, you don't get that same sense because these characters already know and are familiar with each other, so there's nothing new or profound to experience for yourself. You don't get to see Ellie and Dina's romance take shape, and this early in the game, Dina hasn't gotten enough development for us to really care or even form an opinion about her one way or the other. The birthday scene is easily the best section of the game. No combat, no exploration, no intensity. yet the storytelling, acting, and atmosphere make it the game's most memorable moment. In one 20-minute scene, you get to see just how far Ellie and Joel's relationship has come. Remember, it started out like this.
I want Joel to watch over her.
Whoa, I don't think that's
Bullshit,
the
I'm not
best
Ellie.
idea.
him.
The dialogue is top-notch, but Troy and Ashley's performances take it to another level. It's also a cool way of showing how Ellie has learned to swim in the gap between parts 1 and 2. I also really like the scene between Abby and Owen at the aquarium when the two go back and forth about the scars. Abby dismisses them as a fanatical cult, but Owen points out that they, as Fireflies, used to be the same way. It illustrates the point that life is all about perspective. A group of people you might think is bad are probably just an average group of reasonable people who think the exact same thing about you. As good as the actual meat of the story is, there are some questionable elements that hold it back and call reality into question. When Ellie is captured in the school by the wolves, that guy Jordan is about to kill her. Then the other guy comes in and stops it. But then he is about to kill her, and then Jordan stops it. Why? When Dina confirms that Ellie is immune, she just kind of glosses over it and tells Ellie she's pregnant. She took it pretty well, I guess, learning that someone is actually immune to the cordyceps virus in a time when it's believed immunity doesn't exist. Ellie running into the Rattlers who captured Abby in Santa Barbara. What are the odds of that? It seems convenient. There's also a ludonarrative disconnect between the theme that violence and revenge is bad and will consume your life and the actual gameplay. During the game, violence is simultaneously trivialized and glorified with brutal glory kills with both characters. This is accentuated with Ellie as she viciously slays NPCs with her knife in sneak kill animations. Another big problem is characters die and there's no attachment to them at all. Even important side characters like Jesse and Manny. They're barely in the game, and so there's not enough time for development or any reason to care, so when they die it doesn't provoke even the slightest emotional response. Contrast this with the first game. Henry and Sam aren't in the game that much, but they are given so much development that by the time they die you feel for them. You even feel for David. Sure, he's a cannibal and possible pedophile, but he's so meek and pathetic you can understand his desire for keeping Ellie around. Maybe he recognizes that she's a tough badass who could provide useful in a society that needs toughness to survive. And even if you are absolutely disgusted by him, his death will still provide the catharsis of taking him down. Either way, it's because he's written and acted so well that you care. Here, it's difficult to care because the writing is so thin. Characters come and go and get killed, and there's almost no reason to give a shit whatsoever. The game does an incredible job showing Joel as a fractured man, broken down by his lifetime of regrets and bad acts at the end of his life. Despite not being in the game for very long, Troy Baker turns in an incredible performance. The scenes with he and Ellie are without question the best in the game, and it's here that the writing is next level. The writers did a great job leaving some words out so the player can fill in the blanks, and the climactic scene is the best example. The game also does a great job comparing Ellie's life after Joel dies to Joel's life after Sarah dies in the first game. Ellie is also broken and empty after Joel's death, and the parts of the game where she tortures Nora and is about to torture Owen and Mel in the same way Joel does David's soldiers is not a coincidence. The difference here, though, is that Ellie is obsessive, willing to risk everything good in her life to find and kill Abby. Now let's talk about Abby. As much as a lot of people hate her for what she did to Joel, I think she's a good character done in by the narrative structure I've already talked about. You actually see the kind of person Abby is with Yara and Lev, two of the better side characters in the game. You see her caring and compassionate. She has good qualities and would otherwise be a compelling character, but she doesn't get a fair shake to impress because of how disjointed the narrative is. I like the way they use Abby's memory of walking in on her father as he lies dying in the hospital to show how she is affected by the trauma. She clearly has nightmares of that day, and I don't blame her, but it gives great insight into her psyche, which speaks to what I've been saying. She is a good character and has complexity, but she's not given the same opportunity as Joel or Ellie was in the first game. Yara and Lev's arc is interesting because it shows two kids who begin to see the flaws of some of the rules they have to abide by in their society with the Seraphites. They begin to think for themselves and deviate from the norms, challenging the authority which governs their lives. They are treated as outcasts and exiled from society when they dare to break the rules, and are now hunted by both the wolves and their own people. It's a good story that probably everyone can relate to. It's just a shame that by the time you meet them, you probably already despise Abby for killing Joel without knowing why, which dilutes the emotional impact you would otherwise have to their story. and therein lies the underlying problem with the story that I keep going back to. Yara and Lev also give insight to Abby because it's hinted that she feels compelled to help them out, partly because she thinks the way they were casted out was wrong, but maybe too she started to feel remorse for what she did to Joel. Despite how cathartic it was to exact her revenge, she probably realized what she had done was wrong when the catharsis wore off, and by helping Yara and Lev, she could balance out the good with the bad. Abby gets so attached to them that she even kills one of her own fellow wolves that kills Yara near the end of the game, showing that despite the horrible things she's done, she's not beyond saving. Sound familiar, by the way? The fact that I'm even thinking all of this out and weighing it all in my head speaks to the fact that there is a lot of complexity to the story, despite being marred in its execution. Their story is also rife with themes of religion, morality, family, faith, death, and hope. It's easily one of the best parts of the game. The parallels between Abby's relationship with Yara and Lev and Joel's relationship with Ellie from the first game are so apparent that I wonder if the writers thought that by doing so, the player would have the same reaction and affinity for Abby that they did with Joel. In both instances, the jaded, grizzled warrior is thrown into a life-or-death situation with a younger companion, and the two parties have no choice but to work together in order to stay alive. Both are reluctant to venture out together and show indifference to the plights that they are going through, with Joel dismissing why Ellie needs to be taken to the Fireflies, and Abby not caring why Yara and Lev were cast out of the Seraphites. Yet both parties end up relying on one another and becoming attached to each other by the end of the game as a result of the tough situations they are forced to go through. And most importantly, both Joel and Abby use their relationships with Ellie and Yara and Lev respectively to redeem themselves from past wrongs and restore some semblance of morality and humanity in a world where so little of both exists. But it doesn't help Abby's characterization when she has an awkward sex scene with her ex-boyfriend who is now dating her friend and is the father of her child. It wasn't bad enough that the odds were stacked against her being a likable character the way the story is presented, but when you add having sex with someone in a relationship with a baby on the way, it only makes things worse. Yeah, it's not all on her, Owen is a piece of shit for it too, but it's so out of place and jarring that it takes you right out of the story. Remember too that she's supposed to be helping Yara and Lev at this point. But I guess she has time for a quick bang. When Yara gets her arm amputated, Abby sees her father in her dreams alive and well, signifying that she feels good about helping out a friend and it provided her some release. We see the same thing at the end with Ellie when she finally sees Joel, not as he was when he was dying, but when he was alive and well. The message is simple. Kindness will free you of your anxiety. Contrast Abby's characterization with Ellie's during the 3 days. At the end of day 2, after torturing and killing Nora, Ellie realizes she has become the monster that Joel was before she met him, and she hates herself for it. Ellie says she's scared of ending up alone in the first game when talking to Sam, and perhaps that's the reason she's so sad and terrified after Joel is killed. I get what they were doing by withholding Joel and Ellie's final conversation until the end of the game, and like I said, I think it's the only scene other than the birthday that should have been a flashback. When Ellie tells Joel that by allowing her to die in the hospital her life would have mattered, I was begging for Joel to tell Ellie, your life does matter, to me. But he doesn't. He sort of says it in a roundabout way, but it's very typical of these two to not lay their emotions out there. Joel lost everything when Sarah died. His life was defined by his fatherhood and it was taken from him. Not until 20 years later did he get his life back by meeting Ellie and forming the relationship with her that he did. Similarly, when Joel died, Ellie lost herself in the meaning of her life. Ironically, the meaning she was clamoring for was to be the sacrifice for all mankind, and Joel took that away from her, and that's why she was so angry with Joel and hesitant to forgive him. She realized in that final moment when she was about to kill Abby that her life actually did have meaning, to Joel, and she was finally able to forgive him. It's a beautiful scene. Ellie's last conversation with Joel ended with her saying she doesn't know if she can forgive him, but she would like to try. She leaves without doing so. Well, she never got the chance to forgive him. She tells Dina while out on patrol she was thinking about watching a movie with him that night. He gets killed just a little bit later. Because she never forgave him face to face, her regret haunts her and motivates her to kill Abby and release the pain. In her mind, Abby robbed Ellie of her chance to forgive Joel, so her self-hatred is externalized into Abby. This is why she is so obsessed with killing her, and even leaves behind a great life with Dina and her son. She realizes in the final fight as she is drowning Abby that killing her will not bring Joel back, nor will it give her one last chance to tell Joel that she forgives him. When the realization hits her, she finally sees Joel not as he was lying dead on the ground, but as her father joyfully playing guitar on his porch. She finally let go of the hate she had for him lying to her, and in that moment, she was released from the pain. When Ellie tells Abby, "Go, just take him," she's not talking about Lev, she's talking about Joel. She is finally free of the regret of not having told Joel that she forgives him. It is a truly beautiful moment, and it's one that I think a lot of players, including myself, did not even pick up on the first time through. It's moments like this that solidifies my opinion that this game is really, really good. It's just unfortunate that it was presented in such a hectic and unfocused way. The hatred that Ellie feels toward Abby is an externalized reflection of the hatred Ellie harbors for herself. Why? Well, Joel deeply hurt both Abby and Ellie in different ways, and they both punished him for it. Ellie hates Abby for torturing Joel to death, especially because she didn't get a chance to restore her relationship with him. Ellie also tortured Joel, but in a different way, and I'd say in a way that was more painful for Joel, and that was by disconnecting from him. She hates herself for torturing him like that and not restoring their relationship when there was still time. That's the real pain she has been trying to avoid facing during this entire revenge quest. She's like a drug addict, using revenge to avoid dealing with those painful feelings of regret. This is the realization she has while she is drowning Abby, when she has a flashback to the scene on the porch with Joel and chooses to spare Abby's life. She's not just forgiving Abby, she's really, most importantly, forgiving herself and finally coming to terms with what happened between her and Joel. I think her leaving his guitar to rest in the house and walking away is supposed to symbolically represent that she has forgiven Joel, made peace with what happened between them, and is finally ready to move on and start a new life. I hated the end at first, but after much deliberation, I think it's actually really poetic. People saying the game is just about revenge is bad, I think, have kind of missed the point. One final thing I want to touch on is the insane amount of detail to the story that you probably don't even pick up on your first time through the game. I didn't notice many of these until my third time through. Ellie's hairstyle as an adult is similar to Tess's hairstyle in part 1. Coincidence? I doubt it. Ellie bonded with Tess before she ever did with Joel, and I would bet that Ellie saw the badass warrior that she wanted to be as an adolescent in Tess, and probably chose the hairstyle as a tribute. In the beginning, when Joel tells Ellie he teach her to play guitar, Ellie says, "You did," kind of sarcastically. Maybe a dig at his promise at the end of part 1. Like she knows that he lied to her when he swore to her about what happened, and that his promise to teach her to play was just as valuable. The same NPCs are in both hospital sections for Ellie and Abby. When you kill Bear, someone calls out for him, and you later meet Bear as Abby and can even play fetch with him. I also never realized that the sniping scene with Tommy is foreshadowing to Abby and Manny chasing the sniper on day 3. During the flashback, Tommy even mentions that he uses the sounds of bullets ricocheting off of objects to lure out the infected, and he does exactly that when Abby and Manny are in the parking garage. It's insane details like this that have come to define Naughty Dog over the past 2 decades, and it's good to see that they keep raising the bar from game to game. The Last of Us Part 2 has received so much derision and hate from players since its release. I definitely understand why, but I think some of its more better elements were looked over and disregarded because of the strong reaction to Abby killing Joel. While I definitely don't think the story was presented and structured in the best possible way, I have to say that after playing the game 3 times, I really like it. It's not as good overall as the first, but it's a remarkable achievement technically, visually, and mechanically. It has its flaws, but I cannot deny how much fun I had playing through it. I will say though that this does not feel like a worthy conclusion to the saga. If we do get a part 3, my hope is that Naughty Dog will properly conclude Ellie and Abby's stories, as well as giving players the innovative experience we're used to getting from them. But as it stands, The Last of Us Part 2 is a game that deserves to be played so that you can experience it for yourself and decide what kind of game it is. Is it a 93? Is it a 5.7? Or is it somewhere in between?